Hello and welcome to BYJU'S IAS. Let's take up the analysis of today's The Hindu newspaper by looking at an article from page number 5 of the Delhi edition. This article refers to a complaint that has been raised by Prithviraj Chauhan, the former Chief Minister of Maharashtra. In his complaint, he has petitioned the Election Commission of India to investigate as to how an advertising and social media company owned by a BJP office bearer was hired by the Chief Electoral Officer of Maharashtra to issue election-related online ads during the 2019 state elections. See, the article in itself and the politics behind it is completely irrelevant for our exams. But this article brings up the topic of the role of social media in disrupting elections. See, ever since social media platforms exploded on the scene nearly a decade ago, they have been playing a defining role in elections and as well as in revolutions around the world. We got to witness the power of social media in influencing public opinion when the revolutionary Arab Spring movement spread across the Middle East North Africa region from 2011 onwards. It ended up toppling a number of dictatorial governments and even pushed a number of countries into civil war. This made political parties, governments and intelligence agencies around the world to sit up and take notice of the power of social media, and it made them realize how effectively social media platforms can be used to manipulate public opinion and even to disrupt democratic elections. Since then, we have seen political parties investing heavily in social media campaigning, and the role of political parties, private corporations, consultancy firms, governments and intelligence agencies in misusing social media platforms for disrupting elections has raised questions of accountability and electoral fraud. For example, in 2016, we saw the influence of social media on US presidential elections, which involved allegations of Russian involvement in meddling with social media campaigns. Even in India, we have seen how elections have become deeply influenced by social media campaigns, and this has been witnessed during numerous state elections and as well as during the national elections of 2014 and 2019. Then the scandal involving Cambridge Analytica and Facebook has exposed the nexus between consultancy firms, political parties and social media organizations in disrupting the conduct of free and fair elections. See, in the context of Indian elections, social media campaigning has raised two particular challenges for the Election Commission of India. The first challenge is with regard to making the model code of conduct applicable in the online domain, especially with regard to the observation of the silence period. The second challenge is to monitor the expenses incurred by the political parties and by the candidates on social media campaigning. See, the model code of conduct is basically a set of guidelines and norms that has been brought out by the Election Commission of India in order to ensure the conduct of free and fair elections as mandated by Article 324 of the Indian Constitution. These guidelines were first brought out during the 1960 state elections in Kerala, and they have evolved with time into a comprehensive set of guidelines known as the Model Code of Conduct. These guidelines and norms basically place a set of restrictions on political parties and candidates with regard to campaigning, election speeches, public rallies and processions, and these guidelines primarily try to prevent the usage of hate speech by candidates during their speeches and rallies. It prohibits the bribing and intimidation of voters. It also places a set of restrictions on the party that is in power, and it restricts the incumbent government from launching any new schemes and policies after the Model Code of Conduct has been put in place. See, the Model Code of Conduct comes into effect since the day the elections are announced, and it lasts until the entire electoral process is completed. These restrictions on the incumbent government have been applied primarily to prevent the party in power from misusing its position in power to influence voters through new schemes and policies in the run-up to elections. Then it also provides for the restrictions and protocols that need to be observed on polling day, and it also provides for a silence period that begins 48 hours before voting, during which all sorts of campaigning is completely prohibited. See, strictly observing the silence period is very essential to provide the much required time for the voter to decide upon his choice of candidate. It is also essential to prevent the bribing or intimidation of the voter and to prevent the negative influence of any last-minute campaigning by the political parties and the candidates. In the physical world, It is quite easy to observe the silence period because the Election Commission of India, with the help of the police machinery, can strictly enforce the silence period and place a ban on all sorts of campaigning, speeches, rallies, and advertisements in electronic and print media. But observing this silence period in the virtual world has emerged as a challenge for the Election Commission. Because considering the nature of the internet and the reach of social media platforms, it has become virtually impossible for the Election Commission to extend the ambit of the Model Code of Conduct to social media campaigning, and thereby it has become difficult for the Election Commission to tackle hate speech and observe the mandatory silence period as far as social media campaigning is concerned. Today, political parties are spending huge sums of money on running social engineering and influence operations through social media campaigning, and they have even established dedicated IT cells within their parties, and they even tie up with private consultancy firms that provide these services. The next challenge for the Election Commission is to monitor the money that political parties and candidates are spending on social media campaigning. Because see, for election campaigning, the Election Commission would have set an expenditure limit. In the case of Lok Sabha elections, the ceiling is set at 70 lakh rupees. But in practice, these ceiling norms are conveniently breached, and the Election Commission is finding it difficult to track the expenses of parties and candidates on expensive social media campaigns that are designed to influence the voter. So in order to counter the subversion of the conduct of free and fair elections through social media campaigning, the Election Commission has taken a few steps. The Election Commission has extended the ambit of the Model Code of Conduct and the expense limit to social media campaigning and social media advertisements as well. These guidelines and norms places a set of obligations on social media firms and as well as on the candidates and the political parties. Last year, prior to the national elections, social media firms came out with a voluntary code to regulate political content and political ads on their platforms, and they even set aside dedicated resources for this purpose in order to bring in greater transparency with regard to political advertisements. The Election Commission on its part has issued a set of guidelines which applies for social media firms, and under these guidelines, social media firms have been mandated to accept only certified political advertisements that have been pre-approved by the Election Commission of India. They have also been asked to adhere to the silence period norms as per the Model Code of Conduct and to remove all political ads and social media campaigns 48 hours before voting begins. They have also been asked to share all the payments that they have received from political parties and candidates so that the Election Commission can keep a track of these expenses. Then through another set of guidelines, candidates and political parties have been asked by the Election Commission to submit all details of their social media handles while filing their nominations. They should also report to the Election Commission on the expenses and payments that they are incurring on their social media campaigns, and adherence to these guidelines are strictly monitored by the district and state level committees that have been constituted by the Election Commission to monitor political ads that are published on electronic platforms, print, radio, and as well as social media platforms. This committee, known as the Media Certification and Monitoring Committee, approves the election related ads, and it also takes note of any violations. But however, this strategy of the Election Commission to regulate social media campaigning has a number of shortcomings. See, first and foremost, the Model Code of Conduct in itself is not legally enforceable. This is because the Model Code of Conduct does not have any legal backing. It is not a law that specifies the kind of penalties that can be imposed on those who violate the guidelines. So as of now, the Election Commission enforces the Model Code of Conduct indirectly through other related provisions that are found in the Indian Penal Code, the Criminal Procedure Code, and the Representation of People Act. But these provisions are clearly not sufficient, and there has been a long-standing demand to provide legal status to the Model Code of Conduct in order to make it strictly enforceable. As a result of this, the interpretation of the Model Code of Conduct and its violations is left to the discretion of the election commissioners, the chief electoral officers, and the returning officers. So there have been numerous instances where the Election Commission has failed to act even on the basis of genuine complaints received from the public and the opposition parties with regard to violations committed by the candidates and the political parties. Next, The ability of the Election Commission to effectively monitor social media platforms is very limited, especially that of closed social media platforms. While the district and state level monitoring committees do monitor open social media platforms such as Facebook, Twitter, etc., they find it difficult to monitor closed social media platforms such as WhatsApp, Telegram, etc., which have a far wider reach and impact as compared to Facebook and other open social media platforms. Then the Certification and Monitoring Committee of the Election Commission can only monitor the known social media handles and accounts, and it has no resources or means to monitor political advertisements issued by third parties. Then last year, prior to the national elections, the Election Commission had launched the C-Vigil app in order to receive complaints from the public with regard to model code violations. But this application was primarily designed to receive complaints with regard to violations committed in the real world, and it did not factor in the violations that could be committed in the virtual world. So overall, there is still a long way to go for the Election Commission to strictly regulate social media campaigning, and if it wishes to conduct free and fair elections by countering social engineering and influence operations run through social media campaigns, then the answer lies in sweeping electoral reforms that places a set of responsibilities and obligations on not just the political parties and candidates, but also on social media firms and as well as on private consultancy firms. Now let's take up an editorial from page number 6 that deals with the ongoing political crisis in Rajasthan. See, we have been tracking this development over the last few weeks, and according to reports, we understand that the Congress government in Rajasthan is facing a crisis of existence because a rebel camp of MLAs under former Deputy Chief Minister Sachin Pilot have been reportedly looking to defect to the opposition BJP. But again, the politics behind these developments are completely irrelevant to us, but it is very important to understand the legal issues surrounding defection. See, currently, the rebel camp led by Sachin Pilot is currently facing disqualification proceedings at the Rajasthan legislature. And according to the anti-defection law contained in the 10th schedule of the Indian Constitution, the Speaker of the Rajasthan Assembly was supposed to take a call on the disqualification of these rebel MLAs. But even before the Speaker could take a decision, the Rajasthan High Court has stepped in on the basis of a petition filed by the Sachin Pilot camp, and it has ordered the Speaker to maintain status quo with regard to the disqualification proceedings. Basically, the judiciary has intervened in the matter of disqualification on the grounds of defection, even before the Speaker of the House could take a decision on it. So the editorial calls this act of the Rajasthan High Court as judicial indiscipline. This is because in the Kihoto Hollohan case of 1992, a constitution bench of the Supreme Court had made it very clear that the judiciary shall not intervene in the matters of disqualification on the grounds of defection before the presiding officer of the House has made his decision. See, the reason why the anti-defection law was introduced under the 10th schedule was to prevent horse trading and provide stability to a democratically elected government. It was essentially designed to prevent the defection of elected members from one party to another. See, in Indian politics, there has been a long history of defections, and they have managed to destabilize a number of state governments and even the central government. Back in 1967, a Haryana MLA by the name Gaya Lal changed his party 3 times in a single day, giving rise to the popular phrase in Indian politics, Aya Ram Gaya Ram. After a series of defections for years together, finally in 1985, the anti-defection law was brought in under the 10th schedule through a constitutional amendment. Under the anti-defection law, it is the presiding officer of the House who has been given the powers to decide on matters of disqualification. See, under the anti-defection law, the Speaker of the Assembly or the Lok Sabha can open disqualification proceedings against any MLA or MP based on a complaint received by another member of the House. These complaints are entertained on 2 grounds, that is, when the member resigns voluntarily from the party, and 2, when he disobeys the orders of his party leadership, that is the whip of the party. After such a complaint is received by the presiding officer of the House, disqualification proceedings are initiated, and it is up to the discretion of the Speaker to investigate the grounds on which the elected member gave up his party membership, and if he has reason to believe that horse trading was involved with the intention of destabilizing the government, then the Speaker has been given the discretionary power to disqualify such members and withdraw their membership of the House. But even though the presiding officer of the House enjoys a discretionary power, his decisions are finally subjected to judicial review. This was upheld by the Constitution Bench of the Supreme Court in the Kihoto Hollohan case. But in this case, the Supreme Court also ruled that the judiciary shall not intervene before the presiding officer of the House has made his decision. This restriction on the intervention of the judiciary in disqualification matters was placed by the Supreme Court in order to uphold the supremacy of the Parliament and the legislature in the interest of judicial propriety. But the Rajasthan High Court in the current case has chosen to ignore these previous orders of the Constitution Bench of the Supreme Court, and it has not only entertained a petition challenging the disqualification proceedings, but it has also directly intervened in the process, and it has ordered the Speaker to maintain status quo until it decides upon the matter. The Rajasthan High Court has justified its stand on two grounds. One, it has said that it is examining whether the orders of the Supreme Court in the Kihoto Hollohan case is binding on the High Courts. The editorial points out that this argument of the Rajasthan High Court is not valid because obviously the orders of a Constitution Bench of the Supreme Court would be binding on the High Courts as well. 2. The Rajasthan High Court has said that it is examining whether the anti-defection law violates inter-party democracy. The High Court has argued that since the anti-defection law invites disqualification proceedings if a member disobeys the party whip, does this provision amount to curbing of dissent within the party and violation of freedom of speech and expression of the member? While this is a valid ground that needs to be examined by the judiciary in order to plug the loopholes that exist in the anti-defection law, the matter could have very well been taken up at a later date by the Rajasthan High Court without intervening with the discretionary powers of the Rajasthan Speaker that was clearly recognized by the Constitution Bench of the Supreme Court in the Kihoto Hollohan case. So that's the reason why the editorial calls this act of the Rajasthan High Court as judicial indiscipline. Next, in a related column on page number 6, Mr. Sanjay Hegde, a senior advocate of the Supreme Court, writes that the judiciary needs to respect the supremacy of the Parliament and the legislature in their respective spheres of functioning. Because see, in a constitutional democracy, a clear separation of powers has been provided for between the three organs, that is the judiciary, the legislature and the executive. See, in a constitutional parliamentary democracy, the judiciary usually adopts a hands-off approach in matters concerning the inner functioning of the legislature. Because in a constitutional democracy, where the constitution is sovereign, the legislature enjoys its own supremacy within its sphere of functioning. The writer argues that the judiciary would be committing constitutional impropriety if it directly intervenes with the inner functioning of the legislature, especially with that of the powers of the Speaker. Because in a parliamentary democracy, the presiding officer of the House plays a pivotal role, and this constitutional office is the key to protect the parliamentary privileges. So as a result, judiciaries around the world adopt a hands-off approach, and as a matter of convention, they usually refuse to intervene with the inner functionings of the legislature, and they show a healthy respect to the supremacy of the legislature. The writer justifies his argument by citing an example from the British Parliament. See, in 1880, Charles Bordlaw had been elected as a new member of the British Parliament. But since he was an atheist, he refused to take the oath in the name of God, while British parliamentary procedure provided for oath taking only in the name of God. So the Speaker of the British Parliament refused to allow Mr. Bordlaw to take his seat in the Parliament without being administered the oath of office. This matter concerning the inner functioning of the British House of Commons reached the courts, but however, the courts refused to intervene directly, and they adopted a hands-off approach because this was a matter that concerned the sole jurisdiction of the House. There are such precedents available in India as well, and the judiciary has always tried to respect the independence and the supremacy of the legislature within its own sphere of functioning. It is on this legal basis that the Supreme Court refused to interfere in the matters of disqualification on the grounds of defection before the presiding officer of the House had made his decision as per the anti-defection law. This was clearly established by the Constitution Bench of the Supreme Court in the Kihoto Hollohan case. The writer says that this is not the only precedent that should have prevented the Rajasthan High Court from interfering with the constitutional powers of the Speaker. He also points out that the Rajasthan High Court and the office of the Speaker are co-equals with regard to their constitutional status because both happen to be constitutional authorities. The writer points out that it is a well-established precedent in India that constitutional co-equals do not issue orders to each other, but instead they send out requests. On this basis, even the Supreme Court for that matter is not allowed to treat high courts as subordinate courts. Instead, the Supreme Court treats the high courts as co-equals as both are constitutional authorities. So the argument is that one constitutional authority cannot order around another constitutional authority, as that would undermine the sovereignty of the Constitution and the doctrine of separation of powers. The writer argues that it is a well-established precedent in India that the judiciary does not intervene with the inner functioning of the legislature except in the matters of defection, but even this judicial review shall be taken up only after the Speaker has made his decision. So there is no legal or constitutional ground on which the judiciary can make an interim intervention in matters concerning the inner functioning of the legislature. In fact, even in case of routine matters, especially routine administrative matters, the judiciary refuses to carry out any interim intervention, and it asks the petitioner to always take up the case after the final decision has been made by the administrative authorities. So that being the case and the norm, it is quite shocking that the Rajasthan High Court has chosen to carry out an interim intervention even before the final decision could be made by the Speaker. Now the matter has reached the Supreme Court, and its decision, which is expected to come out in a few days, will have great implications for the doctrine of separation of powers and the equation between the judiciary and the legislature, and it will spell out the supremacy of the Parliament and the legislature within their own spheres of functioning. Now let's take up an article from page number 14. The United States and the United Kingdom have accused Russia of testing an ASAT weapon or an anti-satellite weapon. See, for any country, satellites are a strategic asset. Satellites such as communication satellites, navigation satellites, imaging satellites, etc., they find numerous defense applications, and they act as the backbone of a country's critical infrastructure. So if such a critical asset can somehow be destroyed, it would cripple the war-fighting capabilities of that country, and hence most major powers pursue the development of anti-satellite weapons. Even though a number of countries are said to possess anti-satellite capabilities, only 4 countries till date have proven and established their anti-satellite capabilities. This includes the United States, Russia, China, and India. These 4 countries have successfully demonstrated their anti-satellite capabilities, and now the United States has accused Russia of testing an anti-satellite weapon that threatens peace and stability in outer space. See, anti-satellite weapons can be of various kinds. They can be destructive, which would result in the physical breakup of the satellite, or it could be non-destructive, which could only make the satellite non-functional or dysfunctional. One of the most common anti-satellite weapon is the usage of a remodeled ballistic missile. It was this technology that India employed when it demonstrated its anti-satellite capabilities in 2019 through Mission Shakti. Under this mission, a remodeled ballistic missile was used to deploy a kinetic kill vehicle which carries a small explosive payload, and this kinetic kill vehicle is inserted into the same orbit as that of the target satellite, and later it is maneuvered closer to the target satellite. Then either through direct collision or through the usage of an explosive, the target satellite is physically destroyed. Such physical destruction of satellites can also be carried out by the usage of directed energy weapons such as laser-based weapons, or by deploying weaponized payloads in orbit which can be used at a later date in order to target enemy satellites during a conflict. But such anti-satellite weapons, which physically destroy a satellite, result in the formation of a lot of space debris which threatens space exploration and all the other space-based assets. See, over the years, satellite launches and astronauts have left behind thousands of objects, and in addition to this, the physical destruction of a satellite by an anti-satellite weapon will create hundreds or thousands of space debris particles that endanger all the other space assets because of its ability to trigger a domino effect. Then apart from this, we also have non-destructive anti-satellite weapons which basically rely upon electronic jamming of the target satellite. Such anti-satellite weapons seek to make the target satellite dysfunctional without physically destroying it, and this can be done by targeting its communication system, its antennas, onboard computers, etc., either through ground-based assets or through space-based assets. In this case, Russia has been accused of testing a non-destructive anti-satellite weapon by injecting a kill object closer to the orbit of a target satellite, but without causing any physical destruction. According to the United States and the United Kingdom, the intent of the Russians was to just test the deployment and maneuvering technology without actually carrying out the physical destruction of the target satellite. See, such weaponization of space threatens civilian space exploration, and it points out the flaws in the Outer Space Treaty. This treaty was established in 1967, and it prohibits the deployment of WMDs or weapons of mass destruction such as nuclear weapons in space. It prohibits all countries from placing any WMDs or nuclear weapons either in orbit or on any other celestial object. It also prohibits any country from claiming sovereignty over space or any celestial objects. But unfortunately, the Outer Space Treaty has failed to prohibit the weaponization of space or military activities in space. Now let's take up the practice questions for today. Which of the following statements are correct? Heron and Searcher are two indigenous drones being developed by India. India is working with Russia to arm these drones. Both the statements are incorrect, so option D is the right answer. See, Heron and Searcher are Israeli drones that India has acquired, and they have already been inducted into the Army, the Navy, the Air Force, and they are also used by Indian intelligence agencies. They are mainly used for surveillance, reconnaissance, and intelligence gathering because the Heron and Searcher drones are just unmanned aerial vehicles which do not carry any weapons on board. As of now, India does not possess any armed drones in its arsenal, but however, it is in negotiations with Israel to procure the Heron TP variant, which is an armed version of the Heron drone. Apart from this, India and the United States are negotiating the procurement of the Reaper and Predator drones, and the DRDO on its part is running an indigenous program to develop the Rustom series of drones, which is expected to have both the unarmed and the armed variants. This question has been asked because we have an article on page number 11, according to which India has invited Israeli defense companies to strengthen ties by making use of the liberalized FDI regime that has been recently approved by the government. See, recently, the government enhanced the FDI limit in defense sector from 49% to 74% under the automatic route. Then after the recent tensions with China, the government has also allowed the armed forces to go in for emergency procurement, and under this, the army has already taken a final decision to procure additional Spike anti-tank guided missiles and Heron drones from Israel. Now let's take up the next question. Financial Stability Report indicating the macroeconomic stress factors and the resilience of the financial system is brought out by the Reserve Bank of India. Option C is the answer. See, the Financial Stability Report is a half-yearly report brought out by the RBI, and it contains the collective assessment of the Financial Stability and Development Council headed by the Finance Minister, and this report indicates the macroeconomic stress factors and the resilience of the Indian financial system. Now let's take up another question. When loans or advances are in default or in arrears, they are categorized by the lender as credit risk, non-performing assets, liabilities, or derivatives. The correct answer is option B. It is classified as non-performing assets or NPAs. These two questions were asked because according to this article on page number 15, the Financial Stability Report brought out by the RBI indicates that gross NPAs may climb to 14.7% by March next year. Now let's take up the next question. Which of the following statements are correct? The Insurance Regulatory and Development Authority of India is an autonomous statutory body tasked with regulating and promoting the insurance and reinsurance industries in India. It is a 10-member body including the chairman, 5 full-time and 4 part-time members appointed by the Government of India. It was established following the recommendations of the Malhotra Committee. All the three statements are correct. Option D is the right answer. This question has been asked because we have an article on page number 15 that makes a reference to the IRDAI. Now let's take up a practice question from the 2015 prelims paper. Convertibility of rupee implies freely permitting the conversion of rupee to other currencies and vice versa. Option C is the right answer. Now I want you to take this up as an exercise and read about the convertibility of the rupee and understand why the Indian rupee is fully convertible in the current account, whereas it is only partially convertible in the capital account. In this regard, I would also request you to go through the recommendations of the Tarapur committee. Finally, let's take up a couple of mains practice questions. The first question, examine the role of social media in election campaigning and the challenges posed by it to the Election Commission's Model Code of Conduct. The second question, even under a sovereign constitution, parliamentary and legislative supremacy in their areas of working must be respected. Discuss in the context of anti-defection proceedings. Kindly write an answer to these questions and post your answers in the comment section below. So this concludes our discussion for the day. Thanks for watching.